Thank you. Thank you so much. It's actually very fitting that we're having this conversation, which is really centered around the diaspora, if you will, with personal experiences both from Rachel and from Meena. Rachel, when she was at the University of Berkeley, set up a group on Indonesian music consisting entirely of Americans. Not a single Indonesian there because there was no Indonesian to be had. Meena's first forays into restaurants in the United States were a disastrous one in Boston, followed by an even more disastrous one in Washington, D.C. And she soon found out the reason, because the restaurants had no opportunity to hire Indian chefs, and so poor Americans were making the dal. So you have the story of a dramatic transformation, if you will, between a time when this country thought it could do what other countries do well within their own confines, but do it with their indigenous talent, if you will. And as far as India is concerned, or the Indian diaspora is concerned, there's a very heartening statistic in this wonderful book. In 1970, when Meena came to the United States, the number of Indians in this country was 51,000. A half century later, in 2020, it was 4.4 million. So this has really led to two questions. One, predictably, about the entire question of immigration law and practice. And the second, the unique transformation of the Indian in the United States from what might be called a support industry to the actual leadership of industry and talent, particularly in the three areas that she highlights in this book: tech, public health, and policy. It's a remarkable book in the number of faces that it brings in to tell the story of what it quite rightly calls the meteoric rise of Indians in America, the responsibility for which lies in the two words, Indian genius. And we are very fortunate to have with us two of the figures who are represented in this book, Neal Katyal and Siddhartha Mukherjee, who will be joining in this conversation. I thought I would really begin by asking Meena, when you first came to the United States, what is it that you hoped you would be? Because you did go back to India after a few years and then returned in a completely new field of public health. But what was that feeling of, which you've actually captured very picturesquely in this book, your first ride from Logan Airport into the city of Boston?
Thank you, Ramu, and thank you, JLF, for hosting this event and for giving me the opportunity to speak about the book and my geniuses. Before I answer Ramu's question, I have to show off, because honestly, the people in this book are so remarkable. And today, all of you have heard about Trump's tariffs. And I just want you to know, sitting next to me is Neal Katyal, who won the tariff case. So can we please give him a round of applause? So 2 weeks ago, he argued the case, and the case came down, and he found out that he had won. And 20 minutes ago, on his way here in an Uber, he just found out that this case really got under, this win really got under Trump's skin. And he just found out on an Uber over here that it's going to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has accepted, and he is going to argue the case. So sitting in front of you. So as much as I would love to talk about my story, let me just quickly pivot. I'm going to hijack this a bit. Let me pivot first to Neal, because these two are so much more interesting than me. and ask Neal to talk a little bit about, one, the importance of the tariff case, because we're all interested, since India has been subject, as you know, to 50% tariffs, but also he has argued what Michael Ludwig, a conservative judge, said was arguably the most important constitutional case in this last century, which was the Harper and Moore case, and he won that in front of the Supreme Court. And how do you, I just wanted Neal to tell us how these 3 or 4 cases that he fought, what are the threads that you see as being so constitutionally important to the rule of law and saving democracy? Could you just, and then bring in the tariff case?
Well, thank you, and thank you for those very kind words. Let me first apologize. I am Indian. I don't think I'm a genius. And I appreciate being in the book. The book is extraordinary, by the way, because it really tells 15 stories of all of us coming from very different perspectives, but having some core ethics and values and reflections on, well, basically, why our parents came here, and it motivates our work in different ways. For me, the through line between tariffs, between Moore versus Harper which was about voting rights, basically, and democracy protection, and my very first case, which was Guantanamo, is this idea that America is a country in which immigrants can land on its shores and their children can be treated fairly. I remember, I was representing in my first case Osama bin Laden's driver, not the most popular of clients. I went down to Guantanamo. They made it very difficult for me to get there, the Pentagon, but I eventually got to go down and meet my client. And I remember he asked me the simple question, why are you doing this? Why are you representing me? He said, your last client was Al Gore. What are you doing? And I remember at that point I was just a full-time law professor, and I paused and I didn't have an answer for a while. And then I thought to myself in my head, this is why, Neal, you shouldn't be a practicing lawyer, because a guy asks you a question, a simple question, and you don't even have an answer. And a minute goes by and I don't have an answer. And then I think to myself, well, he doesn't, a minute goes by and I say, well, maybe I'm okay. When you ask Justice Ginsburg a question, she takes as long as a minute to answer it, so maybe I'm all right. And then I think to myself, he doesn't know who the hell Justice Ginsburg is. That's not gonna help. But then I told him, I said, why am I doing this? I'm doing this because my parents came from a different country to America. They came not because of the quality of its soil or its sports teams, but because they knew they could land here and their children would be treated fairly. And that had always been my experience. I'd been going to great schools and had all sorts of opportunities, worked in the government, and it was because of the fairness of the American system. And that's what I find under attack today. I find it under attack in birthright citizenship, which I'm fighting in the courts. I see it in sanctuary cities. I see it with respect to the tariffs. The idea that the president on his own can just set these massive tariffs, that's not just a crime against India, it's a crime against the entire world, and particularly Americans' businesses, which are now paying the costs of this. And the whole point of the tariffs litigation is to say, look, maybe you want tariffs, maybe you don't, but in the American constitutional system, it can't be done by the stroke of the president's pen alone. It requires Congress to get involved, which was exactly the argument I made in Guantanamo. I said, maybe you want to have this law-free zone, maybe you don't, but it can't be up to the president by the stroke of his pen to do it. So that's basically the through line in that. And if I'm to reflect on where this all comes from, and Meena, I think, captures it so beautifully in the book, it does come from my parents. It comes from the fact that they, believe in fairness and believe in justice. They're not lawyers. They, in fact, cried when I went to law school. But I married a doctor, so I'm okay.
Speaking of doctors, we have Sid here, who everybody knows, and he is doing some groundbreaking work. And honestly, I'm sure he's going to win the Nobel Prize, but Sid, tell us about some of the groundbreaking work that you're doing.
Well, I too am not a genius, but it's nice to be in a book called Indian Genius. Let me talk a little bit about what we're doing, because I think it's interesting. It has a lot to do with India as well, and potentially has to do with some things India can do to contribute to the future. I work on cancer. I both write books on cancer, but also I'm a cancer researcher. The most exciting thing that we're doing is an intersection between two words, two sort of catchwords in medicine, which is AI and cell therapy. And by that I mean the following. I'll just walk you through the journey. About 10 odd years ago, maybe 15 odd years ago, a group in the University of Pennsylvania and also at Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York discovered that you can redirect T cells in your immune system. You can genetically modify them, you can weaponize them, and you can direct them against cancers. Not all cancers, leukemias, lymphomas, but very poignantly and very particularly childhood leukemias and lymphomas that had relapsed. So these children would have 100% mortality if they didn't have another therapy. The first child to receive this therapy is an iconic child. Her name is Emily Whitehead. She received therapy when she was 7 years old with relapsed refractory ALL, acute lymphoblastic leukemia. She is now going to college. She's 21. This was a complete miracle from the medical standpoint. The problem is that the pharmaceutical companies that acquired this technology in the United States, it's very complex technology. You have to take your own, you have to take blood from the patient with leukemia or lymphoma, then take it outside the body, modify it genetically using viruses, and then return it back, weaponize it, return it back to the patient's body. So complex as it is, the price of these there were two drugs that were made, Kymriah and Yescarta, and the price, if you include the hospitalization, et cetera, in the United States was approximately $600,000. So about 5 years ago, almost exactly 5 years ago, Kiran Shaw and I, Kiran Shaw from Biocon and I, decided that we were going to start a unit in India, in Bangalore, to offer the same therapy, but we hoped at that time, it was still getting there, we're now at about $35,000. We're trying to get to about 10 for patients in India. Now, how did we get to that is a second part of the question. Well, first of all, we used Indian engineers. And the Indian engineers took apart essentially all the engineering pieces of how to deliver this very complex therapy, and they indigenized it. They basically took all the dispensables or the disposables, which cost an arm and a leg because we were being charged an arm and a leg by American companies, and they converted all of those parts into Indian parts. That was one piece. The second piece is that, this has happened since last year, we've started using AI to figure out how to weaponize these T cells. And by that I mean that we've started using AI to make the molecules that ultimately attack the cancer. And in doing so, we decrease the time and research costs dramatically. So usually it takes a pharmaceutical company anywhere between five years, hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars, they might claim, to develop these molecules that will recognize the cancer cell and then kill the cancer cell. We as in my group has developed in collaboration with a group at Stanford and another group, another university group, has developed AI-based mechanisms where we can scan through not hundreds, not thousands, but believe me, billions of molecules per day, and allowed us to therefore find these binders which are responsible to ultimately kill the cancer cells. So I'll end with a very quick story, a personal story, just like Neal did. We started the trial in India about 3 or 4 years ago. One night I arrived in Kolkata. I was there for, I think I was there for visiting people. And it turned out that one of the kids on trial, on that first trial for anti-leukemic therapy, he was 6 years old then. His father was the security guard at this hotel. I arrived from Thailand very late at night, kind of half asleep, and outside my door, this guy was 3 o'clock in the morning, was this man. He was waiting. He'd spent the entire evening waiting for me because he'd seen my name on, some roster or something. And he said that I've been waiting for you all night because I want to bring my child to see you tomorrow. And I said, absolutely. I mean, this would be my, my dream come true. And so the next morning, this child shows up. And first of all, it's a miracle that this child is alive. It's a miracle that, we could put him on trial. And this child is now 12 years old. Just to finish up, my point here is that Indian genius goes both ways. There are geniuses who are immigrants from India to the United States, but there's equally, and I think it's really important to emphasize, there are Indian geniuses in India, and they probably outnumber us vastly.
If I could just take off on that, Siddharth, what is your perception from your vantage point here, as well as having worked in India, on the state of AI in India?
Well, I think there's an enormous potential, and it's an underused potential. And I think if we don't use the potential now, we're going to lose the AI battle, as it were. I don't want to use a battle metaphor here. Obviously to China. We're a young nation. We have extraordinary technical capacity. We have an enormous capacity to learn. We have incredible institutes, as we just heard from the last session. But we need the infrastructure very quickly. We need the infrastructure, and by the infrastructure I mean both the technical and also the regulatory infrastructure, to be loosened so that education can move in that direction. And if we don't do it quickly, and I mean really quickly, we have probably a 3 to 5 year time window. Once that window closes, it will close forever. So I very strongly believe that we should be doing it now, and we should, I know there's been sort of, I would say, piecemeal attempts from the central government to try to do this, and from state governments, including, Karnataka, Bangalore is, of course, where we do a lot of our work, but they've been largely piecemeal, and they cannot be piecemeal. This needs to be just like in China, this needs to be a highly regulated, highly stratified, and singular effort to get in front, because this is a transformative technology, and if we don't get in front of this transformative technology, we'll be left behind.
I'd like to bring that question of AI to Neal as well, because one of the major problems that we have in India, as you know, is the number of years it takes for a case to make its way through the courts, or the number of cases that are quote-unquote pending. And there's been the suggestion put forward of using AI to help clear the backlog of cases. Do you think it's something feasible?
Certainly not now. I mean, it hallucinates far, far too much, and we can't tolerate that in a system of justice. So yes, justice delayed is justice denied in one sense, but I think none of us could really accept a system in which literally false things are happening. Now, I think in 50 years, could we be in a different place, or maybe 30, maybe, but I don't think we're anywhere close to that. I mean, the law at its best is a profoundly human endeavor. It's like, we're talking about sentencing people for crimes, how long they should be, or whether a kid is going to go to the mother or father in a divorce or something like that. There's there's room for logic and so on, but in the hard cases, there's always emotion and there's always human behavior.
Ramu, I apologize, I hijacked your first question a bit, but I just want to mention, we've been talking about genius, and I want to say that the title of the book was provocative on purpose. It's actually meant to be the genius of the Indian people, not so much as that everyone in the book is a genius, although...
Now you tell me.
Although I do think, no, I do think that some of the people are really, sort of geniuses, but how do you define it? I'd be very interested to know how someone like Sid, who's a doctor, would define something like genius. I think we have someone in the audience, Ted Schwartz, who's a brain surgeon, who would have views maybe about how genius resides in the brain. So there is this theory about, the Malcolm Gladwell theory about if you spend 10,000 hours, anyone can learn to become a fabulous violin player or something or the other. But then there's the other theory that, no, you have to have a combination of talent and the 10,000 hours. It's a very it's very value-ridden thing, this thing to call someone a genius. It sort of implies that you have something that no one else can aspire to, that it's a God-given gift. But so I'm hesitant to, if you really want to, it's a provocative title, but it is true that without the hard work, I don't think any of these people would have achieved the success they had. I think, Neal, why don't you just mention, for example, I was so impressed with the mock trials that you conducted for your Hamdan case.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe I'll start by saying, to the extent I have a genius, it's thinking that I'm not very good, actually, and that I need to always do two things. One is really learn from other people, and I don't care if they're, higher up or lower than me. They can be a subordinate. I'll explain what that is in a minute, but really a bottom-up understanding of knowledge. And the second is just relentless practice. I had an uncle when I was 7 years old, not a true uncle, but a family uncle who's like an uncle, and he said to me, to make it in this country, you're going to have to work 10 times harder than someone who is born, someone whose family is born here and stuff like that. And I always took that to heart, and that's how I am. So before every Supreme Court argument, I moot the case. That means practice the case, and I practice it with, a whole variety of people who are, like most senior partners, most established government lawyers ever, but also people who haven't even gone to law school and who are watching. And they're, of course, sworn to secrecy, and they're all throwing questions at me. And I'll do this for 2-3 hours each time. And for each argument, particularly the big ones, like in Gitmo, I did it for 15 times. In Moore versus Harper, I did it 8 times or 9 times. And they're throwing all the questions at me, and then I record it on MP3, and then I'll go and jog to it or something like that and listen to it and ask myself, number one, can I answer the question better? Number two, can I answer the question in a way that invites a further question that I really want? And number three, can I answer it in a way that doesn't invite a follow-up question that I don't want? Because in a Supreme Court argument, I have 30 minutes per, that's it, 30 minutes, and they are throwing question after question after me. I get about 60 questions in a 30-minute argument. So basically, I have to be super precise at every moment. And it's that practice session, and it's from learning from my team and not being hierarchical and saying, oh, just because you haven't argued this many cases, I'm not listening to you. good knowledge can come from anywhere.
And with medicine, I think it's pretty obvious the hours and hours that a doctor has to put in, not to mention science and scientific research.
I think, I mean, I agree with Neal. I mean, you know, there's an enormous factor of time and repeating things and learning things over and over again and trying to perfect them as much as possible. I can't agree more.
Wonderful. We've got a signal that we should now enlarge the conversation to the audience. Anyone here, please, who'd wish to ask a question, including, please, to the meteoric rise of the moderator in Meenakshi Ahamed. But sorry, please. I'm sorry. The
lights are in our face.
Yeah,
so
the lights are. But if our friends with microphones can hone in on whoever wants to speak, please.
Hi.
Thanks.
Neal, good luck with SCOTUS. Amazing work, Siddharth. Kiran is great. Hi, Ramu. But my question is for you, Meenakshi. Post-tariffs, the intelligentsia, talking heads, the pundits, the academia in India, there's been a vociferous reaction against not just the tariffs, but America. And the phrase, Indians are the new Jews, seem to have, come back. And there are a couple of fairly good commentators and journalists who've written editorials suggesting that the Indians in America, the Indian Americans, should have a low profile during these choppy times. And various things that have happened since the new administration attest to the fact that being out there probably and being very vocal is not the right thing. What is your reaction to this thought?
Well, I've never believed in having a low profile. So I believe in just standing up for the truth and for justice. You have to stand up for what you believe in. Otherwise, why live? And I have written critical things about Modi that came in the Washington Post and stuff. So I was worried when I went to India whether they were going to confiscate my passport. But I felt something had to be said about things that he was saying about the Nehrus and stuff like that. So, if you believe in something, you've got to say it. I think that I have had several op-eds in my head, but I feel like everybody's got an opinion, and so many people have written them that, in a sense, what I wanted to say, a lot of people have actually said quite well about what Trump is doing with immigration. I think it's all pretty appalling. Maybe when I finish book tour, I'm still going to write something, but I don't think Indians should keep a low profile about what's going on. I think if Indians feel that there is injustice, when you have a society, that's how Hitler came into power. That's how tyrants come into power. No.
And if I could just jump in, because I have an oral argument in the morning in Philadelphia, so I'll be leaving right after this. But I definitely share your view that it's our duty to speak. At the same time, I will say there are particular costs being an Indian American when you do speak out. I mean, every day I have all sorts of stuff commenting on my skin color, my race, how I smell, all sorts of stuff that is thrown at me in emails and letters and sometimes visits to my office and things like that. So I do think that there's, the questioner is right to say there is something that is different. That's not a reason not to do it and not to stand up. But it is, it does make it different than when other people are, two people can say the very same thing, but one of us gets a different reaction than the other. So,
I start a lot of my talks out by discussing sorry, Neal's phone has been blowing up ever since the Supreme Court agreed to take the tariff case, so he has to leave. But I start out by talking about the Statue of Liberty and Emma Lazarus's poem on the Statue of Liberty. It's a very compassionate poem, and they placed it right where in the harbor where every immigrant coming in could see it. That was the spirit of America. If you look at what Ronald Reagan, George Bush, Lyndon Johnson, every single president has always been pro-immigration. And, they've recognized that there have been problems with it, but everyone has recognized this as a country of immigrants. And I start out by saying that every wave of immigrants has added and helped this country build. Indians are just the most recent ones. And in 1965, this is a date that's really important for Indian immigrants because that is when they relaxed immigration for Asians. And the reason they relaxed immigration for Asians was two things happened. One, President Johnson passed the Medicare Act, and all of a sudden, like 20 million Americans were eligible for health care. But the hospitals didn't have enough doctors to cope with this new influx. At the same time, Vietnam happened, and you had all these people being shipped out to Vietnam, a lot more casualties, doctors being shipped out, and a great need for more doctors. So the medical system was under a great deal of strain, and they needed doctors. And so where were they going to go? The medical system didn't have enough medical personnel, so they went overseas, and they looked for qualified doctors who spoke English. So they went to the Philippines and a couple of other places as well, but India was a big recruitment ground. So in India's case, they brought in highly qualified people because it wasn't just that Indians were coming into this country because they were looking for opportunities. There was a need in this country for the skills that India had. And as the lady in the last session pointed out, Nehru had invested in the IITs and in all these medical institutes just at the time when America had this need. The second thing was driven by foreign policy. Sputnik had happened, and the US military was freaking out that the US was going to fall behind in the arms race in the Cold War. So they started investing heavily in MIT, in Stanford, and all along the East and West Coast in these educational institutions, but they weren't enough engineers. 9 million people had been shipped to Vietnam during the course of the Vietnam War, a lot of young kids. So there weren't enough young people, there weren't enough engineers, so they went on a recruitment binge for engineers, and IITs were graduating all these people, and India didn't have the absorptive capacity to give them jobs, so they came here. So this was a push-pull. There was a need in the US, and India had the capacity and the overflow. So I think it's important to remember that, there was a very complementary relationship here of need and of supply and demand. So I don't think Indians who've come here have anything to feel ashamed about. They should be very proud of their contributions. And I think we need to remind people when they complain about the contributions that Indians have made.
Thank you, Meena. Another question?
Time's up.
Right, we'll take that as the cue. Thank you very much for joining the session. Thank you, Meena. Thank you, Siddharth. And the book is outside.